Hello and Assalamu Alaikum. I'm Safia Osmani and we're back with Fulbright Women Podcast Season 2. We're excited to bring to you 20 brilliant women who are pushing the boundaries in their fields and lives and serving as inspirations to so many around them. Joining us today to kick off the season is Nigar Noor. Nigar got a master's degree in special education from the University of Minnesota. Her passion lies in teaching kids with autism, raising awareness regarding its early detection and intervention, and normalizing inclusive teaching practices in general education classrooms. She has worked on several projects pertaining to kids with varying abilities and their inclusion in education. And currently, she manages the academic team at Orenda, which is responsible for creating Taleemabad workbooks and daily lesson plans for primary grades. As part of this organization, she has also been responsible for creating the Early Childhood Education Program for Taleemabad schools. Hi, Nigar.
Hi, Safia. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
I'm so excited to be talking to you today. Finally, we're able to, record this podcast.
Yeah, same. I've been getting emails about the Fulbright Women podcast, and I was actually waiting for the emails to be sent out to apply for it. And I was so excited when I finally did it.
Yes. That's amazing. Yes, I was super excited to speak with you as well. Let's just dive right into it, Nigar.
Yeah, sure.
Let's just begin with, I want to understand, how did you decide that you were interested in learning more and working with kids on the spectrum?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that I absolutely knew that I would want to work with students or kids on the spectrum. After I graduated from college, after my bachelor's degree, I interned at a school where I taught a student who was on the spectrum. And over there, I, had the opportunity to interact with a lot of students who were either on the spectrum or had ADHD or had some sort of learning disability. While I was working there, I really sort of got to know what actually autism is. At the time, I didn't know I would really want to continue this as my career. After that, I switched and started working at a research institute. But when I started working over there, I really understood how much I missed teaching, and that was something that really naturally came to me. So yeah, that is how my journey began.
What do you think is the experience for autistic kids in Pakistan when it comes to educational experience?
So in Pakistan, so if we compare it, let's say according to research, 1 out of every 54 8-year-old students are diagnosed with autism in US. But if we compare that to Pakistan, there is no reliable data to report how many kids in Pakistan are diagnosed with autism every year. So obviously, if you don't know how many students are there with autism, we consequently don't have enough services or infrastructure or trainings that can help students learn in school. So our schools, number one, definitely are not equipped with certain kind of resources. Number two, our teachers to keep their teaching practices inclusive. And it's not something very difficult, honestly. These students, so every student is different when they're on the spectrum. They have their own kind of needs. Once they are assessed, we can understand what sort of particular services they need. So number one, the issue is we don't really know what autism is. So consequently, parents don't get their students assessed. In my school where I was working, we knew that most of our students lied somewhere on the spectrum. But when we asked the parents, have you ever gotten your child tested? They would say, no, what does that mean? We've never been to a psychologist. We've never gotten our child assessed. So when we say get your child assessed, it doesn't mean that we want them to have a label of autism. Having your child assessed only helps us understand what the child needs, what are their talents, how can we make their learning easier. So once they're assessed, we can then move on to making intervention strategies for them. But we're lacking on the first step. We don't know that we need to get our students assessed. And honestly, a lot of pediatricians, even, they don't know where to send a certain child when they think they might be on the spectrum.
When you're speaking with the parents, right,
Yeah.
are there any symptoms that you ask them, I'm talking in context of early detection, right? Do you ask them to look for certain symptoms in the kids? And if you do, what is that conversation like?
Yes, so basically, there are certain red flags that we need to be aware of. For example, the child not making eye contact, delayed speech, the child sort of, it seems like they're happy in their own world. They don't want to interact with anyone. Not, the how children, they just pretend play, they don't pretend play. So these are certain, just some of the red flags that if you see in your child, you can get them assessed. It doesn't mean that your child has to be on the spectrum. It doesn't mean that your child has autism. These are certain red flags. If you notice, you just go to your pediatrician or you get your child assessed from a school psychologist. But we definitely have to tell the parents that it's not something that's bad. It doesn't mean that your child has autism. These are certain red flags. Because the earlier your child gets assessed, and if we know the child might be on the spectrum, the better the intervention strategies work. The better we can develop strategies to teach the child academically.
All right. So is there also an age limit as to what is the age limit that you should be monitoring your kids up till, some say, I don't know this, I've heard these things. Some say you should keep looking till the age of 4 or 5 or 8. Talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so these red flags, they can start appearing as soon as 18 months or 2 years or 3 years, because that's the age when we really start expecting kids to start interacting with other kids, start really interacting with their parents, respond to their name. So those 2 years, 18 months, 3 years, that's the time that if you really notice, you can see certain red flags. Sometimes we might ignore them because every child is different. A child may have delayed speech, but it doesn't mean the child has autism. So just be aware of certain kind of things. If the child has certain repetitive behaviors, that's very important. If the child has certain obsessive interests, for example, the child is just obsessed with a certain cartoon character. The child is obsessed with having things done in just a certain way. So just these are certain red flags. If you notice them as soon as 2 years or 3 years, I say get your child assessed. There's nothing that will basically help us, help the intervention strategists to develop a better strategy for your child on how they can teach them and how they can manage their behavior.
Let's assume, the parents have taken their kid to be assessed, and the kid has been diagnosed with, let's say autism. What are some of the earliest intervention techniques that you recommend should be incorporated then?
Yeah, so autism is a spectrum. It's a huge spectrum. And there are two major features. Number one, lack of social interaction, or we can say not knowing how to verbally or non-verbally communicate. And number two is certain repetitive behaviors or obsessive interests. So these two can lie anywhere on the spectrum. It could be very severe, it could be very mild. For example, the child might not interact with others. They would want to just be with themselves, but they won't have any obsessive interest. So any of these two things can lie anywhere on the spectrum. So every child is different. After the child is assessed, the assessment is very important because the assessment tells us what the child's talents are, what the deficits are, what might the child need when we're planning their intervention. So according to those, we plan the intervention strategies. For example, I'd say the child is really particular about having their routines in a certain way. So we then teach the child what to do when something happens out of the blue, because obviously our routines can't be that predictable all the time. So we teach them certain replacement behaviors. For example, the child is used to coming home and having lunch and then taking a nap, but then one day some guests arrive, that can happen any day. So the child might have some, you know meltdown or something. So we teach them replacement behaviors: what to do when you're angry, what to do when something happens out of the blue. Maybe you can go to your calming corner. Maybe you can punch your pillow in one corner of your room. So things like that, we teach them slowly and gradually with lots of positive reinforcement. That's very important. We teach these children tiny baby steps, anything in tiny baby steps, and reinforce them along the way. Lots and lots of reinforcement, anything that they like. So the intervention really depends on what the child's deficits or what the child's strengths are.
In terms of how have you found these kids that you have worked with reciprocate to the techniques and things that you try to teach them?
Oh yes, if we teach them in according to their level, according to what they need, the results, we can see the results. For example, one of my students, he had a lot of social anxiety. He wouldn't come inside the school. It would be cold and January mornings. He would just stand outside in the playground and wouldn't come inside the school because he had lots of social anxiety. He wouldn't want to come inside and see other students. So what we did was, every day when he used to come to school, we would say, okay, you can take your time coming in. We would ask other students to, free up that space so he doesn't see any students along the hallway. And slowly and gradually, we decreased that time of him staying outside. We wouldn't hover around him of having him come inside the school. And then slowly, over the span of 1 month, that time of staying outside the school in the playground decreased. And then again, he wouldn't come inside the classroom. He wouldn't sit. His sitting span was very, very small. He would sit for like 30 seconds and then he would want a walk break. So what we used to do was we would say, okay, you know what? We're going to sit on the table and do a tiny task for 30 seconds. Then you can get a 1 minute break. So that 1 minute break acted as a reinforcer for him. So before even he could just jump out of his chair, we would give him that break. And then gradually we increase that time from 30 seconds to 1 minute. Okay, now today you're going to sit on the table for 1 minute, and then we're going to give you a 1 minute walk break inside the classroom. Over the span of 2 months, we used the same technique where we would reinforce the child for sitting on the table for 1 minute, then 1 minute 30 seconds, then 2 minutes. And that eventually increased up to 20 minutes. So if we do these things repetitively, if we reinforce the child and see what the child's specific weaknesses or specific strengths are, we can work around that.
There are a couple of things that you mentioned earlier about like the social skills and, just being very obsessed about certain behaviors or certain things, right? There's one more thing that I was curious about. Their sensory needs, right? Can you talk about that, the sensory needs, and how do you help, and how can people, parents or the teachers, help these kids on spectrum to cope with their sensory needs?
There's a lot of research that has gone into understanding if it's actually true or not. There are a lot of research that has not proven that giving certain sort of sensory stimuli to those with autism helps or not. A lot of people use pressure. They try and give pressure to the child with pressure jackets, for example, certain sort of visual stimuli. These things help in calming. We've seen that they do help in calming the students, but honestly, they would help anyone with calm. For example, if you take someone in a dark room with little lights on, a cozy, make a cozy space.
So it's going to be comfortable for anyone.
Really, yeah. For anyone,
yeah.
exactly. So yes, we do use these. So the bottom line is, if anything works for your child, that's fine, do it. if it makes the child calm, all right, then do it. It basically acts as a break time for your child. But students also learn that if I throw a tantrum, I might get what I want. So we really need to understand if the students are trying to get away from something or if they really are having a meltdown. For example, every time I would ask my students to come sit on the table because it's work time now, he would just start crying and say, I want a break. Or my head is hurting, I can't do this. It's not because the head is actually hurting, it's because the student doesn't want to work. So this
how do
particular
you
child was,
differentiate?
oh yeah, so if a child is having a tantrum, the child will never hurt him or herself. But if they're having a meltdown, chances are that they might end up hurting themselves or the others. So we really have to understand if it's a tantrum. We really need to see what happened right before this behavior that might have triggered the child's meltdown or the tantrum. But then we use certain techniques. We try and ignore the child and make the child understand that you won't get the break until you do this particular thing. And then you can ask the child, okay, just do your work for 30 seconds and then I'll give you the break. And if the child does that, you give the child that break, so that that association um, between doing your work or doing what I want and then you getting what you want, that becomes strong. So this child of mine, my student, he was obsessed with numbers. He would ask me that if he can play with numbers every 5 minutes. So we used that as his strength. We used that as a reinforcer. We would ask him, okay, we're going to do our work time right now. We're going to do some addition problems. If you do that correctly, if you do these 5 sums, you're going to get the number flashcards for 5 minutes. And that would work. That would really work. Initially, he wouldn't come near to the table to do his work. But then when we really built a strong association between him doing his work and then getting break time, it worked. So it's just that you need to understand what works for the child.
Nigar, I really want you to expand on the intellectual capabilities of the kids on, the spectrum. I ask this question because, it's also a taboo, not just in our part of the world, but, around a lot of, in a lot of countries as well. They consider, if the kid has autism, right? बहुत जगह पे they also call it just like disability, right?
Yeah.
I want you to expand on that bit first in comparison to the intellectual capabilities of kids on the spectrum in comparison with neurotypical kids.
Okay, so autism is completely a behaviorally defined condition. Its causes are not completely known, but it could be genetic or non-genetic. So their intellectual abilities are absolutely, we could say that the intellectual abilities of a neurotypical child and the intellectual ability of a child on the spectrum, they're the same. There's nothing different. They do not have any sort of intellectual disability because of autism. And since it is behaviorally defined, these students might have a problem with interacting with others in the same way we expect neurotypically developing children to interact. This is why they can't learn things the way we expect other children to learn. And that barrier of communicating with these kids, that makes us think that they are intellectually not as sound. For example, one of my students, he was gifted, he was talented, he was absolutely amazing academically, but he had certain, I would say, issues interacting with other people. He did not understand certain verbal cues. I used to teach that. I taught him for 1 year, and I sort of understood how I can teach him better and better. And it worked great. He used to say he wanted to become a mathematician, and he was absolutely amazing with multiplication. He was 7 years old at the time, and he would do mental maths. He would multiply 20 by 22 in just less than a minute mentally. He would do that. So there was nothing. So we can't say that their intellectual ability is not um, is somewhere, I would say, less than those that are neurotypical. It's just that their way of communicating is different, and we do not understand how to communicate with them or how to teach them. This is why we see that they are not usually academically sound, because we do not understand how to teach them. The same student, he shifted his schools. After a year, I talked to his parents and asked how he was doing. They said, he says he hates maths now. This child who wanted to become a mathematician and was so great at it started saying he hates maths, probably because he wasn't taught in the way he liked or would work for him. So it's just that communication barrier that puts them, I would say, at a disadvantage. If we learn how to communicate with them and how to teach them, they can learn just fine.
So I guess what I hear here is that it is failure on our part as a society or as a system of education to incorporate different people with different needs, as opposed to just sticking to one formula that just seems convenient for us, right? I guess what
Absolutely.
I want to ask you, would you recommend for kids on the spectrum, or neurodivergent kids, to have a separate system of education, or should our regular system of education, as we see around us, be expanded to, create space for these kids? What do you think is good for these kids?
Yes, so yeah, that's a very good question. So, Safia, I mean, we are social animals. We need social interaction, and that is what makes us humans. So, these we one of the identifying feature of autism is that they do not socially interact with people the way neurotypically developing people do, and they're just happy in their old world. But they do need certain sort of social interaction. So I'd say yes, we need to incorporate them in our general education classrooms. We need to better equip our teachers. We need to train teachers on how to understand if they think a child is on the spectrum or not. We need to have more resources, such as a separate classroom where the child can go. So I think it's better if we have the resources in our already in our general education schools, because the practice these days is that schools claim to be inclusive, but what they do is they provide a shadow teacher to the students, and that shadow teacher sits with the student in a general education classroom and helps the student do his or her work. So we can say that we're being inclusive. However, the child absolutely gets no chances of interaction with other students in the classroom, which is one of the most important things I think a school environment can provide: social interaction with peers, because this is how we learn a lot of things. So I think it's very important for our schools to develop the infrastructure and train teachers on how they can assess if a child need, how they can, basically decide if a child needs to get assessed, and if they do have a child who's on the spectrum in their classroom, how can they develop an intervention strategy? Maybe have a school psychologist in the school who can assess the child and then develop an IEP, an individualized education plan. And then they decide on from there how much time the child would sit in the classroom, how much time the child needs to have group sessions with the peers, how much time the child will have pull-out sessions with one-on-one sessions with a teacher. So I think we're lacking over there. But then again, I would also say that if a child's behaviors are not harming other people or themselves, why do we change them? For example, if there's a certain repetitive behavior that a child does, hand flapping, or if a child always wants something in his hand to keep himself or herself calm, why do we want to replace that behavior?
Is
As long
that
as the
what's called
behavior,
stimming?
yes, we could call that stimming or stemming, yes. So a lot of parents, they want their child to not do these
But
behaviors,
why?
but because but why, yeah, I know. One of my students, he used to make some sounds, and honestly I thought if we train the child and teach the child, he could, become a musician. He could do beatboxing, or I don't know what we call that. uh, but I know if I suggested that to the parents, they would be like, no, that's not what we want for our child. We want the child to study and become a doctor and an engineer or whatever. So as long as the child's behaviors are not harming their own self or others, why do we want to change them? We, while teaching these students, we can't start with a mindset of wanting to change them or fix them. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just that they learn in a different way, and we need to understand. We need to teach ourselves what the appropriate way of teaching these students is.
You said some really important things here, and I have noticed that around me as well. And this is something I want you to address the parents here, right? Why do these
Mm.
parents who were probably expecting an XYZ kind of a child and ended up and were blessed with, a certain other kind of child that was not their expectation, now they want to fit them in that box that they have. Now they're the ones who are rigid, right? So they're the ones who are embarrassed
Yeah.
of the kid. And I think you can speak about this more, that kids can absorb the energy that is around them, right? So if the parent who is with the kid is feeling embarrassed of the kid's stemming, right, or sounds, while that is a completely normal thing for the kid to do, they're actually just kind of telling the kid that, they're not proud of the kid, or they really want to fix
Yeah.
them, like you said. I want you to address that.
Yes, absolutely. I think the number one step in that is acknowledging the fact that your child is a little different. Once you acknowledge that and understand your child, things can become easier from there. I wouldn't say easier. I mean, it's hard. I understand it's hard for the kids, but once you realize, you need to be acceptant of the fact that yes, your child is different, so that you accept that there will be certain strategies to teach your child or manage your child that are different. So, because unless you accept that, you won't be able to give your child what the child actually needs. And yes, I think I completely agree with you. Children can sense those negative vibes. One of my students, when he started coming to our schools 3 months down the line, his behaviors were like his mother said that he was doing absolutely great at home now. He liked school, he wanted to come to school, he was finally making friends. But she told us that a couple of months earlier, when he was going to a different school where he wasn't being accepted, he was a different child. He could sense the negative energy around him. So we need to be accepting. Number one, the parents need to be accepting. They need to accept and acknowledge the fact that yes, their child is different, but there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that we need to teach, or we need to interact with the child just a little differently. Once you accept that fact and acknowledge that, you will be able to give your child what the child needs. So I think, yes, that's very important.
You mentioned about the shadow figure that are assigned to the kids when going to the school, right? And I kind of want you to talk about, what can parents do enable to understand whether the school that they're sending their kid to is a good environment, a wholesome environment for their kid, and whether the shadow figure that has been assigned to the kid is doing the job that is needed for the kid to grow and evolve. How can they keep, like, what are some of the barometers that they can, have and keep a check on their child's growth?
Yes. Number one, I would say if we talk about Pakistan, that's a huge problem. There are not a lot of schools. definitely for kids who have moderate symptoms, mild to moderate symptoms. Schools that have neurotypical developing students, they do not accept students who are on the spectrum. They only accept those who are neurotypical. And then there are certain schools there that cater to those that show severe symptoms. So those students that have moderate to mild symptoms, they have nowhere to go. So I'd say yes, talk to schools about your child's certain needs. Number one, the school has to be accepting. The school has to provide certain services. If you do end up taking or having a shadow teacher, I would say invest in the child's IEP. An IEP is an individualized education plan. This basically lists down everything your child needs to have in the intervention strategies, or basically their goals set out for the child for the entire year. So have meetings with the schools, monthly meetings with the schools, monthly meetings with the shadow teacher, so that you see and keep that IEP as a standard check. Um, is my child working toward this goal? Is my child working towards this goal? I think for that, school needs to take data. Data is very, very important. The parents can ask the schools for that data. Do you have this month's data that can show that my child is progressing towards this goal, so that I can see that by the end of the year my child might achieve this goal, and this goal might just be sitting in the classroom for 30 minutes with only one break. So if the data shows that it's not working, maybe change the strategy, maybe change the intervention strategy, or maybe the shadow teacher is not trained enough to work with the child. So I think data is very important. Schools need to be very, very particular about taking data regarding the child's progress. And then they need it to be very, very transparent. Parents can ask for that data whenever they want. It's their right.
I've also noticed this one thing in terms of, the shadow figures, like we said, are when they're assigned to, and I'm not talking about Pakistan here, there was some, a case study that I saw that a shadow figure has been assigned to the kid, right? Sometimes their strategies are so fear-based to just prevent, they are so controlling of the kid out of fear that the kid might act out. So they won't even let the kid interact or participate in a large kind of group activities, right? In such cases, I think I would like you to talk about that it's not always about just being afraid of what the kid would end up doing next, right? Or if he's going to start acting out. It's about letting them just express themselves. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think there are two very important things that I want to point out over here. Number one, yes, we can't be afraid of the child's behaviors. We need to understand why these behaviors occur in the first place, and if a behavior occurs, what to do next. Because we can't control the conditions in which the child is all the time. There will be situations where the child would not like a certain thing and might end up, exhibiting an undesirable behavior. For example, crying out loud, throwing things, etc. So this is why assessment is so important, because once the assessment is done, we understand what are the triggering factors, and according to those, we make the intervention strategies. We need to train the shadow teachers of what to do when a certain triggering thing occurs or your child starts crying. There need to be certain SOPs that you need to follow, and not just the shadow teacher, the general education teacher or other teachers in the school need to know what those strategies are. When I was teaching, we used to have a weekly meeting with all our staff. We used to basically tell other teachers what our child's triggering factors are, and these are the things that we need to do once the child starts having a meltdown, so that every teacher in the school knows what the SOPs are. So we need to have those strategies in place, and everybody needs to know what to do. The number two, yes, there are a lot of times when we don't teach students how to communicate what they're feeling. If they're feeling angry, what to do? They only know that they need to shout and scream, and that is how others will know that they want a certain thing. One of my professors once told me that the best thing that you can do for a child on the spectrum is teach them how to communicate. Any form of communication. It doesn't have to be verbal. So what we usually do is we use a lot of visuals for these students. For example, a visual that says angry, or a visual that says happy, or a visual that has a picture of food on it. So the child can say that I am hungry. And then we respond to the child's request only when the child communicates with us through that appropriate communication system. For example, if the child cries because the child is angry and doesn't want to be in a noisy room, we would remind the child about what the appropriate way of communication is. Maybe you can show me the card that you do not want to be here. So once the child does that, we take that child out of the room. Or if a child is hungry, he might start crying. We remind the child that you need to tell us that you're hungry and what that appropriate sign is for you to tell me that you're hungry. So I think if we teach children an appropriate form of communication, that can really, really help, control the behaviors. I had one of my students, we used to do this exercise every morning where each child, we had name cards, and each child used to put their name cards in an emotion pocket, telling us how they're feeling. Maybe they're happy, or they're sad, or they're angry. So one day we were in a different classroom, and one of my students got accidentally hit by someone. That made him really angry. He wanted to cry. But because we used to do this exercise every day, he ran outside the classroom, and I just was getting ready to control the meltdown. I went after him. He went to his classroom and took his name tag and put it in the angry pocket to show or to communicate that he is angry. Once he did that, I knew that he was feeling angry and I need to calm him down. So if you teach children how to communicate appropriately, we can manage their behaviors. And we can't expect them to do this all the time. They will get angry, they will scream, but we need to understand that they're humans. We need to understand that we do give them certain sort of communication communication rules or communication language through which they can basically just tell us how they're feeling, and then we can take it on from there.
Communication makes me, think about sometimes these kids, some of the kids are nonverbal till a certain age, right? Can
Yeah.
you talk about that? If kids are nonverbal, do the strategies change? I assume a lot of these remain the same because you're teaching them nonverbal cues, but talk about that to the parents, sometimes parents just lose hope and they're just in this concern
Yeah.
and this worry that their kid might never be able to speak. Talk about that a bit.
Yes. So we do recommend the parents to take their child to speech therapy if they really, because these kids can speak. It's just that they probably are not comfortable with that, or they I wouldn't say that we need to force these kids to just speak to communicate. There are a lot of different ways through which they can communicate to us, and one of them is through visuals. Sometimes they point to certain things regarding what they want. And then after a certain while, you kind of understand the child's body language. But of course, only the child's parents or teachers can understand. We need to give them a system, and we need to teach them that they need to follow a standard way of communication throughout. For example, if the child wants water, they might point towards water, and we ask them to at least say the initial sound. They want water, water, or something like that. They can just say water. They don't have to say the entire sentence, I want water. They can just say it. So what we do is whenever a child wants something, we say, okay, you can have it, but can you just say the word? What do we call it? So this is something that doesn't happen in speech therapy. You need to do this for the entire day. But sometimes we might see kids get frustrated because they can't really speak, or they don't want to speak. So in those cases, don't force the child. Just and be very quick with the reinforcement. Just have them say the initial sound. Just have them say that word, and just give them what they want. if speaking doesn't work, you can use visual cues. If that doesn't work, you can use certain signs. Yes, no, this way. So it's all up to you what you consider is best for your child, and also what works best for the child. There are children who are very good with visual cues. There are children who might be, who might show great responses to speech therapy. So yes, but don't just stick to speech therapy. There are a lot of different ways where you can teach students to communicate.
Nigar, I'm curious, what are some of the self-regulation techniques that we can teach these kids?
Yes, so these are replacement behaviors basically. So usually they could be calming behaviors. For example, if something happens that they don't like, we tell them that they're not supposed to throw things or, scream. We can see what works best for the child. We can make a small calming corner. We had a small calming corner in the school, um, where it's a dark room with a cozy corner. It has a lamp. It has a tray with certain beans or rice in it, where the kids can basically touch them and play with them. So these are certain ways where you can help and basically teach the children that these are certain things that you can do when you're not feeling calm or when you want your own time. But with certain students, we need to understand what is their way of making themselves calm. Maybe they want to stim. You can let them do them. Let them do that, because they're not harming anybody by stimming or using certain thing. If you really don't want them to do it in front of other people, you need to teach them that they need to go in a corner and then do it. So I think, yes, it really depends on the child, what works for them, what they want, what helps them calm down. So there's not certain one standard thing that works for every child.
Is there any like food recommendation, diet recommendation for autistic kids to follow? Because I see some things, I've read some things online, but I really don't know if they're backed by science or they're myths. So I really want you to touch upon that.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of parents do believe that having a gluten-free diet will help their children, but honestly, there hasn't been any research to back up this fact. It has not been proven that giving a gluten-free diet or sugar-free diet will help with the symptoms of autism. No, it might be some other thing. It might, the child might be allergic to gluten, but that doesn't have any relationship with autism, right? For example, if child is if it so it could relate to it in this way. For example, if a child is allergic to something, the child eats that food, it shows an allergic reaction. The child is probably having a tummy ache or a headache. Now the child doesn't know how to communicate that, and that is because of autism. And this is what triggers the meltdown or the undesirable behavior. So it's not that the allergic reaction or that thing has caused autism. They get related because the child doesn't understand how to communicate how they're feeling.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I guess I've taken a lot of your time, but towards the end of it, I kind of want you to, just address, does it get better for these kids, in terms of communication, in terms of socialization, in terms of just developing and coping with skills that can just make them more independent and just lead an independent life? Does it get better?
So, it's not a disease that will go away if you take medicines. I would like to describe it as a personality type. Um, you can't grow out of autism. It's just that you learn and understand what are the ways that you can help your child navigate smoothly. So that is the ultimate goal, to teach these kids how to become independent. A lot of our intervention strategies include uh, te- teaching students how to brush their teeth independently, how to make a meal, how to go outside and buy a certain thing from the market, things like these, so that they can become independent. So yes, if we teach them, we start teaching them at the right time, the right kind of strategies that work best for them, then we can say, yes, they might be able to lead an independent life. But then again, it's an entire lifestyle change. We can't expect that we teach them certain things or work with them up to a certain age and then it's done. No. There are certain transition programs that have been developed for these students when they are leaving high school and entering into college, maybe, or when they are when they start their teenage years, or when they're starting a new job. So there are certain transition programs, because obviously early interventions are different from the interventions that we give to teenagers or that we give to adults. So these teaching strategies will evolve time to time, and we need to understand that we need to try and make the environment better for them, the situation's better for them. We can't impose them to do things that the society thinks are normal, right?
Yeah.
We need, yeah, we need to basically change our perspectives.
Yeah. I think just as an ending note, I personally believe, and it's not to trivialize anything, I just personally believe just this conversation around kids on the spectrum, right, is a good learning lesson for all of us, to just be more open and flexible and receptive towards all kinds of people, right? It could also apply to me and you, right? We're not all the same people, right? It's only becomes a little more apparent in the case of kids on the spectrum because they need, there are certain needs that make them like, we need to equip them with those needs, right? Because otherwise all of us, a lot of us in our societies are living in with suppressed emotions, right? With suppressed identities, with so much trauma, and we are not as a society, equipped to just accept everyone for who they are, right? Correct me if I'm wrong in the way I'm looking at it, because I personally get frustrated with parents who have kids who are different than what they must have expected their kids to be, right? I understand it's difficult. I get it. But then it's also difficult because you had a rigid set of mind, right? What to expect out of a new human being that was coming into your life. If we just accept people for who they are and then create environment for them, I think it can be easy for all of us.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I think it's all about accepting these students for who they are. Like I said, we don't need to fix them. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with anybody. It's just that we're all different. They are different from us. So we need to take ourselves out of that normal, normal behaviors or normal human thing that the society has basically imposed on us. There's nothing normal. You know what I mean? Everyone is different, and it's us who need to learn and to understand that we need to be more accepting and make the environment a comfortable one for everybody around us. And honestly, if you think about it, all of us have these certain,
Quirks
fixated.
and yeah.
Yes, absolutely, that we're very particular about. For example, I want my routine to be very predictable, and if it doesn't happen, I get very frustrated. So the thing is that those with autism, for them, these feelings are exaggerated. And it's nothing wrong. It's just that their way of communication or their way of telling us, it's just a little different. So we need to understand, and we can't change them. We don't have to change them. They don't have to change. We have to be more accepting.
Yeah, and a little less judgmental.
Yeah.
I think that's what
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
It was Amazing talking to you, Nigar. I had a lot of fun. I never realized
Thank you,
it's been an
Sophia.
hour already, and I know I can go on forever talking about this topic. And there's so much
Yeah.
more to learn and unpack. Hopefully, in another episode, we could do it again. But thank you so much for
Yes.
giving me your time, and all the best with
Thank you
everything that
so
you're doing,
much.
because it's very important work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Sophia. It was really nice talking to you too, and I'm really happy to be a part of this series. Thank you so much.